Today on Bench Briefs, we're looking at a landmark decision from the Supreme Court of Canada that tackles the delicate balance between protecting cultural identity and upholding fundamental freedoms. The case is Quebec Attorney General v. Lalande, decided in 2026, and it raises important questions about language laws and freedom of expression in Canada. At the heart of this case is a dispute over Quebec's language laws, which require businesses to use French exclusively on their commercial signs and advertising. Lalande, a business owner in Quebec, challenged these provisions. He argued that forcing him to use only French on his storefront signage infringed on his freedom of expression, a right protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. On the other side, the Attorney General of Quebec defended the legislation, saying it was essential to preserve and promote the French language and culture within the province. So, what actually happened? Lalande owns a business in Quebec and wanted to include English on his commercial signs alongside French. However, under the province's language laws, specifically the provisions at issue here, the use of French had to be exclusive. Lalande felt this was not just a business restriction, but a violation of his right to express himself freely. He brought his case forward, challenging the constitutionality of these language laws. The Supreme Court had to consider two main legal questions. First, did these provisions mandating exclusive use of French on commercial signs and advertising infringe Lalande's freedom of expression under Section 2B of the Charter? And second, if there was an infringement, could it be justified as a reasonable limit on rights under Section 1 of the Charter? Section 1 allows the government to impose limits on rights if those limits are demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Let's break down these issues. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right that protects individuals' ability to communicate ideas and information. Commercial expression, like advertising and signage, falls within this protection because it conveys messages to the public. The question was whether Quebec's requirement for signs to be exclusively in French restricted Lalande's ability to express himself in the language of his choice. If the court found that freedom of expression was infringed, the next step was to analyze whether the infringement was justified. Quebec argued that its language laws serve a pressing and substantial objective: preserving the French language and culture, which are central to the province's identity. The court had to weigh the importance of this goal against the impact on individual rights. In its decision, the Supreme Court recognized that the language provisions did indeed infringe on freedom of expression. Requiring exclusive use of French limited the ability of business owners like Lalande to communicate in other languages, including English. However, the court also acknowledged the significant cultural objective behind the law. The real test was whether this infringement was a reasonable limit under Section 1. The court applied the well-established Oakes test, which asks whether the law is rationally connected to its objective, minimally impairing of rights, and proportionate in its effects. The court found that while the goal of protecting the French language is undoubtedly important, the requirement for exclusive use of French on commercial signs went too far. It was not the least restrictive means to achieve the objective. Instead, the court suggested that allowing French to be predominant on signs rather than exclusive would still support the preservation of the French language while respecting freedom of expression more fully. This approach strikes a better balance between collective cultural interests and individual rights. Why does this case matter? Quebec has long had special language laws designed to protect French as the province's official language. These laws reflect the unique cultural and historical context of Quebec within Canada. But this decision shows that even deeply rooted cultural policies must respect constitutional rights. The ruling emphasizes that governments can pursue important societal goals, but not at the expense of fundamental freedoms unless the limits are carefully tailored. This case also sets an important precedent for how courts will approach conflicts between cultural preservation and freedom of expression going forward. It underscores the importance of proportionality and minimal impairment in justifying limits on charter rights. For business owners and citizens, it clarifies that while cultural identity is vital, individual rights remain a cornerstone of Canadian democracy. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bench Briefs. Be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into Canada's most fascinating legal decisions. Until then, take care.